Good day, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join this information session on the course titled The Introduction to the BC Building Codes. My name is Nicolaos Athanassiou, and I'm the instructor of the Introduction to the BC Building Codes course at Ashton College. Before we begin exploring some of the course aspects, I'd like to take a moment and share a bit about my background. Personally, I've been involved in the construction field both directly and indirectly for the past 20 years. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to work in several different roles within the industry. And this has given me the opportunity to see construction projects from multiple perspectives. I originally began my career as a nationally certified building inspector. And early on, I sort of developed a strong interest in understanding how inspection practices and building standards all work together to ensure that buildings are safe for occupants. And soon after becoming a building inspector, I then expanded my qualifications further by getting licensed as a specialized contractor. In between, I was also fortunate to complete training and acquire qualifications in environmental sampling and interpretation as an indoor environmental practitioner. Now, these qualifications further provided an understanding of the relationship of how environmental factors and safety considerations interact with construction practices. And in 2017, I was hired by my local housing authority to serve as a municipal building inspector. And in that role, I was responsible for reviewing projects, conducting inspections, and working with builders and contractors to basically ensure that construction met the applicable regulatory requirements. Interestingly, it was during this time that I gained significant exposure to the building codes used in my own province of Quebec. Now, during my tenure, municipal inspections actually provided valuable insight on how building codes are applied in practice, not just as written regulations, but as tools that guide construction quality, safety, and accountability across the industry. And through these experiences, I've developed a strong appreciation of how building codes influence nearly every stage of the construction process, from design to building permit, construction, and all the way through to final inspection and occupancy. So briefly, this is basically where I come from. Okay, so now let's consider the following. Okay, we have to keep this in mind. Every building that we enter, which could be our homes, it could be a hospital, it could be a shopping center, or a movie theater. Each of these buildings were designed according to rules that most people actually never get to see. And these rules are called building codes. Okay, then this raises the following question. What exactly are building codes? So let's begin with a brief definition. So building codes are regional laws that actually govern how buildings are designed and constructed. They regulate construction methods, types of building materials, and safety requirements to help protect occupants and the public. Now, early on in my career, when I was working as a private independent building inspector, my services did not involve enforcing building codes. Instead, my work focused more on building standards. Now, while both building codes and building standards focus on occupant safety and apply to most, and in some certain cases, not all buildings, in certain circumstances, an important distinction exists. Building standards often describe best industry practices or industry performance expectations. Building codes, on the other hand, are enforced by law and represent the legal minimum requirements. In addition, Many people are unaware that regardless of whether you're a homeowner or the owner of a commercial or industrial building, there are very few situations where building codes do not apply during renovation projects or when it relates to new construction. I'll give you an example. Even something as simple as constructing a tree house, okay, in the backyard of your home, it actually may require a permit if it exceeds certain limitations established by the code. And some of you may be wondering, okay, so what are these limitations? Well, limitations might be its overall square footage, right? The square footage of the treehouse itself, or the height of the treehouse. So once again, before a single line is actually drawn on an architectural plan, or before a renovation idea is realized, the code asks one simple but very important question. What type of building is this? Okay? So today, we're going to explore why that question matters and how it shapes the safety of every space that we live, where we work, and where we gather. Okay, so let's continue with the topic of this presentation, which is titled How Buildings Are Classified and Why It Matters. So when building codes are applied, whether for new construction or renovations in an existing building, one of the first considerations is how a building is classified. The term classification simply means placing something into a specific category. But in the context of building codes themselves, classification determines far more than just a label. For example, think about the dwelling you live in right now. Okay? Now recall the last time you attended a live concert or visited a movie theater. Okay, so let's compare the two. The home where you are right now and the movie theater. If we try and visualize them closely, all these buildings are constructed very differently, and that's not accidental. Those differences are not determined by architectural style alone. In fact, very early in the design process, the building code asks, what will this building be used for? Because only when that question is answered, it influences nearly every safety feature that follows. Now let's consider another example from a safety perspective. I would like all of you to imagine the following two buildings, any type of single-family home, and compare that to a hospital. Okay, so if you had to guess in your mind, what are some obvious differences between their observed designs? Okay. Now, for one thing, hospitals are much larger. They're more technologically complex, contain hundreds of occupants, and there's people constantly going in and out. Okay, so there exists a continuous movement within this building. So the building code takes these differences into consideration, and through building classification, will result in very different safety requirements for each. Now consider a shopping mall and compare that to a multi-unit residential condominium building. What differences would be immediately noticed between these two types of structures? Now, shopping malls typically have a large horizontal footprint, while residential towers, and they're more often than not, they're vertical. Residential towers often have a significant vertical footprint. Each condition introduces different risks and results in different code responses. Okay? Now, at this point, building codes might sound technical, and sometimes they can be, but there's the important idea that building classification is not necessarily about paperwork per se. It's all about predicting human behavior. Okay, and what types of interactions take place in particular buildings. And these examples are where we sleep, how we gather, how we move through spaces, and how we evacuate during an emergency. Now, once you begin to see buildings through that lens, the building code makes much more sense. So every building in Canada is assigned an occupancy classification based on its intended use. For new construction, this classification informs architects, engineers, builders, and authorities having jurisdiction about which safety requirements must apply. Now, the same process occurs when owners apply for renovation permits. Consider a few examples. If people sleep in a building, certain precautions and protections are required. If hundreds or thousands of people gather in one space, other precautions and protections apply. If commercial or industrial activities occur within a particular building, additional risks must be addressed. Sometimes a single building contains multiple types of occupancies, and each has its own safety considerations. Therefore, classification groups buildings according to use, and that use determines which portions of the building code will apply. Now, let's consider another plausible example. When you walk into a movie theater, or a concert hall, or a sports stadium, have any of you ever noticed how many exit doors there are? There's usually quite a few. And this is because these buildings fall into what the code categorizes as assembly occupancies. Essentially, these are places where large numbers of people gather at the same time. Now, compare the overall indoor space of a concert hall to a typical home. What differences do we immediately notice? Well, homes are smaller, much smaller, and they have independent rooms. They have much narrower corridors and fewer exits. Assembly buildings have wider corridors, multiple stairways, and numerous exits to safely accommodate large groups of occupants. Okay? So since we know we have a basic idea of classification as intended use, let's briefly go over some common occupancy categories. In the British Columbia Building Code, buildings are grouped into major occupancy classifications, such as, for example, we have residential occupancies, which comprise of houses, apartments, and condominiums, and essentially where people live and sleep. Then we have occupancy classifications with the title of assembly occupancies. And those examples fall into theaters, arenas, churches, and stadiums, and this is where people actually gather. Another classification title is business and personal services occupancies, and those include offices, banks, and professional services. Then we have mercantile occupancies, and those include stores, shopping centers, and this is where basically goods are sold between retailers and the consumer. And finally, we have another occupancy that's titled industrial occupancies, and those include factories, workshops, and processing facilities. So each major occupancy classification communicates risk, conditions to the code, and determines applicable safety requirements that will eventually be implemented. Now, why does classification matter? So once a building is classified, design professionals and authorities having jurisdiction will use that information to determine the following: the number of exits required, corridor and stairway widths, fire separations, which are extremely important, if the building requires any sprinkler systems, and fire performance expectations. And these examples are not exhaustive by any means, because the code also addresses structural systems, plumbing, heating and ventilation, accessibility, types of materials, and increasingly for the last 20 years or so, how buildings can be constructed or improved in terms of their overall energy efficiency. Again, most people enter buildings every day without ever thinking how they're classified. But behind the scenes, classification quietly influences how buildings are designed to keep occupants safe. So when you walk into a school or a hospital or a shopping mall, you're seeing the result of many building code decisions that were made long before construction even began. So before today, have you ever thought about buildings being classified in this way? Probably not. Okay? But perhaps now you may begin noticing buildings from a different point of view. So every home, store, theater, school, or hospital represents a series of decisions intended to protect the people inside. So building codes may seem technical at first, but at their core, they exist for one purpose: to safeguard how we live, where we work, and where we gather. And understanding building classification is one of the first steps towards understanding the system of building codes. All right, so now that we have been introduced to today's topic, I'd like to briefly outline the learning experience itself. So the building code course is delivered once per week over a 12-week period, with each session lasting approximately 3 hours for a total of 36 hours. Now, upon completion, successful students receive a certificate of participation from Ashton College, and this certificate authenticates their participation in the training. And as the course title suggests, this is an entry-level overview designed to make the building code more approachable and understandable, especially for individuals encountering it for the first time. Now, many people assume the building code is only intended for architects or engineers. Now, while those professionals rely on it daily, this course takes a different approach. Our goal is to translate the code into practical, understandable concepts connected to real-world construction and housing decisions. So at its core, the building code functions as a legal framework that establishes minimum standards for safety, accessibility, durability, and occupancy. So rather than memorizing rules, students learn why those rules exist, and just as important, how to navigate the system logically. So the course itself is delivered online through live synchronous sessions that allow real-time participation and discussion between the presenter and the students. And class sessions are also recorded to provide flexibility for learners. So the intended audience is diverse and can include homeowners seeking understanding of permits and renovations. It could include real estate professionals expanding their building knowledge. It's also made for individuals exploring careers in construction or municipal services. And of course, industry professionals seeking familiarity with the British Columbia regulatory framework. So throughout the program, we examine real-world applications where the code acknowledges and operates municipal departments, construction sites, design environments, renovation projects, and inspections. And participants also receive practical guidance on how to look for, read, and to a certain extent, interpret code requirements. So in other words, the objective of the course is not to create building code experts immediately, but to provide a strong foundation, giving learners confidence to access the building code, understand its structure, and continue developing their knowledge independently. So regardless of whether your interest is personal or academic or professional, this learning experience aims to provide clarity, confidence, and a practical starting point for your own further growth. Thank you.